What if the greatest highway in human history was not made of stone, but of silence, sand, and silk? Good evening, and welcome back to the channel. Or if this is your first time here, I'm truly glad you found your way. Tonight, we begin a journey that once stretched across deserts, mountains, and empires. A journey so vast that it quietly reshaped the world, while most of its travelers simply followed the next caravan bell into the dark. Before we begin, take a moment to settle in. Dim the lights. Let your breathing slow. This is a place for drifting, for letting the noise of the day soften into the background as history unfolds gently, chapter by chapter. If you're listening from somewhere in the world tonight, I'd love to know where. Leave a comment below and tell me the city, the country, or even just the landscape around you. Whether it's a quiet apartment in a glowing city, a farmhouse beneath open sky, or a small room lit only by a bedside lamp, there's something beautiful about knowing that while we explore ancient roads together, we're scattered across the modern world. And if you enjoy slow, immersive storytelling designed to help you rest while learning something real and timeless, consider subscribing. This channel is devoted to long-form historical journeys, told gently, thoughtfully, and without rush, so you can drift into sleep while traveling through centuries. Tonight's story is the story of the Silk Road, not just a trade route, but a living thread that tied China to Rome, monks to merchants, conquerors to pilgrims, a road that was never truly a road at all. So settle back, let your eyes grow heavy if they wish. The caravan is forming, the camels are kneeling in the dust, and the first light of dawn is beginning to touch the horizon. Our journey begins now. Before it was called the Silk Road, before caravans etched their patient lines across deserts and empires leaned toward one another like distant stars tugged by gravity, there were only scattered paths, hoofprints dissolving in wind, river crossings remembered only by reeds bent low. The Silk Road was never a single road, never a neat ribbon tying east to west. It was a breathing network of desire, stretching and contracting across centuries, shaped by merchants, monks, conquerors, and wanderers who rarely understood that they were participating in something that would outlive them all. Our journey begins in the 2nd century before the Common Era, in the age when the Han dynasty of China stood firm against the northern steppe confederations known collectively as the Xiongnu. The Han court in Chang'an, a city of orderly avenues and imperial palaces, did not yet imagine silk draped across Roman shoulders. It thought instead of survival, of horses, of alliances. Emperor Wu of Han sought partners to counter the power of the nomads who harassed the northern frontier. To find them, he sent an envoy westward into lands unknown to the Chinese court. That envoy was Zhang Qian, a court official whose journey would become legend. He did not set out to create a trade route. He set out to find the Eurasia, a people displaced by the Xiongnu, and to persuade them into alliance. Yet history often disguises its greatest transformations within smaller ambitions. Zhang Qian was captured by the Xiongnu and held for years before escaping and continuing westward. He crossed mountain ranges and deserts, moving through Fergana and Bactria, encountering kingdoms whose languages and customs differed from anything known in Chang'an. He saw tall horses that sweated blood, grapevines heavy with fruit, and markets that connected lands farther still. When he returned to China after more than a decade away, he brought not soldiers, but knowledge. Knowledge was the first cargo of the Silk Road. The Han court learned of regions rich in horses, glassware, precious stones, and strange crops. The emperor's interest in Fergana's horses, prized for their endurance and speed, sparked diplomatic missions and eventually military campaigns. Trade followed diplomacy, and roads followed trade. Not roads built of stone in the Roman manner, but protected corridors, garrison towns, beacon towers, and supply stations, extending from the Chinese heartland into the Hexi corridor, that narrow passage between mountains and desert, which served as the gateway to Central Asia. Silk, long treasured within China, became the empire's most valuable export. Its production was a closely guarded secret, tied to the cultivation of mulberry trees and the delicate labor of silkworm cultivation. Silk was light, strong, luminous. It carried status. It could be folded into small bundles, yet purchased loyalty across borders. The Chinese state often paid silk as tribute or salary, and in the markets beyond the frontier, it became a currency more trusted than coin. From Chang'an, caravans moved northwest through the Jade Gate, leaving behind irrigated fields and entering the vastness of the Taklamakan desert. The Taklamakan was not merely sand. It was an ocean of shifting dunes bordered by oasis cities, fed by glacial meltwater from the surrounding mountains. To cross it directly was to invite death. So the Silk Road divided, splitting into northern and southern routes that skirted the desert's edges, linking oasis kingdoms like Kucha, Turfan, Khotan, and Kashgar. These oasis cities were not passive rest stops. They were vibrant cultural crossroads. Their inhabitants spoke Indo-European languages now long extinct. They practiced forms of Buddhism, local animist traditions, and later, Manichaeism and Islam. They minted coins bearing Greek motifs and Indian scripts. In their markets, one could hear tongues from across Eurasia. Merchants rested in caravanserais, enclosed inns designed to shelter men, animals, and goods from bandits and sandstorms alike. Each oasis was both refuge and filter, taxing goods, exchanging wares, and transmitting stories. Beyond the Tarim Basin rose the Pamir Mountains, called the roof of the world. Caravans climbed narrow passes where a misstep could send pack animals tumbling into ravines. Snow lingered, even in summer. The air thinned. Yet beyond these heights lay Sogdiana, a region in present-day Uzbekistan and Tajikistan that would become the beating mercantile heart of the Silk Road. The Sogdians were traders without equal. Their homeland, centered around cities like Samarkand and Bukhara, was fertile and strategically positioned between China, India, Persia, and the steppe. Over centuries, Sogdian merchants established diasporic communities across Central Asia and into China itself. They served as intermediaries, translating languages, negotiating contracts, and spreading goods and beliefs. They carried not only silk westward, but also silver, spices, glassware, and slaves. Their letters, preserved in desert ruins, speak of profits and losses, of shipments delayed, of anxieties over raids and political upheaval. They reveal the Silk Road not as romance, but as risk. To the southwest lay the Parthian Empire, heir to Achaemenid Persia and rival to Rome. The Parthians controlled crucial segments of the overland trade routes. They understood the value of mediation. By positioning themselves between East and West, they profited from both, while limiting direct contact between their powerful neighbors. Roman demand for silk grew steadily after contact intensified in the 1st century BCE. Roman elites admired its softness and translucence, though some moralists decried it as decadent. Silk garments flowed into Rome through multiple intermediaries. Few Romans understood that the shimmering fabric originated in distant China. Fewer still imagined the complex chain of exchange that carried it across continents. To the east, the Han dynasty expanded its influence deep into Central Asia during the 1st century. BCE and CE, protectorates were established to secure the routes and ensure safe passage for caravans. Chinese envoys reached as far as the Parthian realm, though there is no firm evidence of direct contact between Han China and Rome in this early period. Indirect exchange flourished. Roman glassware and Mediterranean silver have been found in Chinese tombs. Chinese silk fragments have been uncovered in Roman contexts. Yet the Silk Road was not solely an east-west artery, it was a lattice. North-south routes connected the steppe to settled lands, facilitating the movement of nomadic confederations who would, at times, become conquerors. The Kushan Empire, formed by Yuezhi migrants in Bactria and northern India, controlled a critical segment linking India to Central Asia. Under the Kushans in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, Buddhism flourished and travelled northward into the Tarim Basin and China. Monks journeyed alongside merchants, carrying sutras, relics, and artistic styles. In this way, the Silk Road became a spiritual highway. The deserts did not distinguish between trader and pilgrim. Both faced thirst, heat by day and freezing cold by night. Both trusted in guides who knew where wells lay hidden beneath crusted earth. Camels, especially the two-humped Bactrian camel, were indispensable. Their broad feet navigated sand, their humps stored fat, their temperament endured monotony. A caravan might move only 20 miles in a day. Months could pass between departure and arrival. News travelled slowly, often distorted by repetition. The fragility of the network was constant. A change in imperial policy, a war between steppe confederations, an outbreak of disease, any of these could disrupt trade. Yet resilience lay in redundancy. When one corridor faltered, merchants shifted to another. Sea routes across the Indian Ocean grew increasingly significant during the 1st century CE, linking Roman Egypt to India and beyond. Spices, pearls, and textiles moved by ship as well as by camel. The Silk Road, then, must be understood not as a single road, but as an evolving system, integrating land and sea. As the 2nd century CE unfolded, the Han dynasty faced internal strain. Court intrigues, eunuch factions, and peasant uprisings weakened central authority. In 220 CE, the Han collapsed, fracturing China into competing kingdoms. Political fragmentation disrupted state protection of the western routes. At the same time, the Roman Empire grappled with its own crises, and the Parthian Empire fell to the Sasanian Persians in 224 CE. Each imperial shift rippled outward, altering trade patterns. Still, caravans did not cease entirely. Commerce adapts. In periods of fragmentation, local powers often stepped in to secure segments of the route. Buddhist communities in oasis towns continued to host travelers. Sogdian merchants persisted in their networks. Silk continued to move west, though sometimes in reduced volume. What endured above all was the idea that wealth and wonder lay beyond the horizon. The Silk Road thrived on imagination as much as on goods. In Chang'an, stories circulated of distant lands where tall men wore togas and drank wine from glass cups. In Roman cities, tales spread of Ceres, the mysterious silk-producing people at the edge of the known world. Neither side fully grasped the other, yet both sensed connection. The early centuries of the Silk Road reveal a paradox. It was born from imperial ambition, yet sustained by ordinary individuals. Emperors commissioned expeditions and built garrisons, but it was anonymous camel drivers, translators, artisans and innkeepers who maintained the pulse of exchange. The Silk Road was not a monument. It was an accumulation of countless footsteps. In the centuries to come, this network would expand, contract, fracture, and reunite under new empires. Religions would travel its length. Technologies would migrate across it. Armies would thunder along its corridors. Plagues would follow in their wake. Yet in these beginnings, in the journeys of Zhangqian and the rise of oasis kingdoms, we see the essential pattern: curiosity overcoming distance, profit outweighing peril, and the human impulse to connect stretching across the spine of Eurasia. The Silk Road began not as destiny, but as improvisation. A mission for horses became a web of civilizations. A thread of silk became a filament binding continents. And in the vast silence between mountains and desert, a new kind of world, interconnected, restless, and transformative, began to take shape. By the 3rd and 4th centuries of the Common Era, the Silk Road had already survived the rise and fall of dynasties. It had endured the collapse of the Han in China and the transformation of Parthian Persia into the Sasanian Empire. It had witnessed Rome's splendor and Rome's strain. And yet, like a river adjusting to shifting banks, the great web of exchange did not disappear. It changed its currents. The political map of Eurasia in late antiquity was unsettled, but it was not empty. In China, the long period of division that followed the Han collapse fractured the north and south into competing kingdoms. Nomadic peoples from the steppe moved into northern China, founding short-lived states that blended their own traditions with Chinese administrative practices. To the west, the Sasanian Empire rose in 224 CE, determined to restore Persian power and identity after centuries of Parthian rule. The Sasanian centralized authority strengthened Zoroastrianism as a state religion and guarded their western frontier against Rome, while keeping a careful watch on trade routes to the east. The Silk Road in this era was less about singular imperial dominance and more about negotiation between powers. Each empire understood that wealth flowed not only from conquest, but from control. Taxation points multiplied along caravan corridors. Cities fortified their walls. Rulers extended patronage to merchants while also demanding tribute. Yet amid political fragmentation, something more enduring than silk moved along the roads. Belief. Buddhism, which had originated in northern India centuries earlier, had already begun its gradual journey north and east. The Kushan Empire had played a decisive role in this transmission. Under rulers such as Kanishka in the 2nd century CE, Buddhism received imperial support, and monasteries flourished along trade routes linking India to Central Asia. Monks traveled with caravans, relying on the same infrastructure that supported commerce. In oasis cities like Khotan and Kucha, Buddhist communities translated scriptures into local languages, commissioned murals, and carved cave temples into cliff faces. As centuries passed, these oasis centers became luminous islands of faith in the desert. At Dunhuang, near the edge of the Chinese world, Cave complexes adorned with vivid paintings depicted Buddhas, bodhisattvas, donors, and scenes from sacred texts. The art bore stylistic traces of India, Persia, and even Hellenistic influence, demonstrating how visual culture traveled as surely as textiles. In the cool darkness of these caves, the Silk Road's spiritual dimension revealed itself. An exchange not of goods, but of ideas about suffering, compassion, and enlightenment. By the 4th century, Buddhism was taking deeper root in China itself. Translators labored to render Sanskrit texts into Chinese, grappling with philosophical terms that had no direct equivalent. Pilgrims would soon begin traveling in the opposite direction, journeying from China toward India in search of authentic scriptures and holy sites. The Silk Road thus became a two-way conduit of devotion. Meanwhile, to the west, Christianity was undergoing its own transformation. The Roman Empire, after centuries of sporadic persecution, officially embraced Christianity under Emperor Constantine in the early 4th century. As the Roman world Christianized, theological debates intensified, and missionaries carried the faith eastward beyond imperial borders. By the 5th century, Christian communities, particularly those associated with what later came to be called the Church of the East, had established themselves within the Sasanian Empire and farther into Central Asia. Thus, in caravan cities, one might find Buddhist monasteries, Zoroastrian fire temples, and Christian churches within days of travel from one another. Zoroastrianism, the ancient faith of Persia centered on the cosmic struggle between truth and falsehood, remained influential under Sasanian patronage. Sacred fires burned continuously in temples, maintained by priests who guarded ritual purity. Traders moving between Sasanian lands and Central Asia carried not only goods, but cosmological concepts. Ideas of dualism, judgment, and the moral weight of human action. Religions did not merely coexist, they interacted. Manichaeism, founded in the 3rd century by the Persian prophet Mani, blended elements of Christianity, Zoroastrianism, and Buddhism into a universalist system that spread rapidly along Silk Road routes. Mani envisioned his faith as the final revelation, synthesizing earlier traditions. Though often persecuted, Manichaean communities appeared from North Africa to China, evidence of how swiftly ideas could traverse continents when borne by merchant networks. The Silk Road during these centuries was less stable politically, but increasingly rich intellectually. It was an age of translation. Words crossed linguistic boundaries, metaphors shifted form. A sutra written in Sanskrit might be translated into Sogdian, then into Chinese. A Christian text composed in Syriac could reach Central Asian congregations. Each translation was an act of interpretation, subtly reshaping belief. At the same time, the steppe remained a dynamic force. Nomadic confederations rose and fell, sometimes raiding settled lands, sometimes integrating into them. The mobility of steppe peoples meant that they too participated in Silk Road exchange. Horses, furs, and military expertise were traded for grain, textiles, and luxury goods. The steppe was not a void, but a connective tissue linking east and west across the northern arc of Eurasia. In China, the period known as the Northern and Southern dynasties saw waves of cultural blending. Northern regimes founded by non-Han elites adopted Chinese bureaucratic systems and patronized Buddhism. Over time, distinctions blurred. This cultural fusion prepared the ground for reunification under the Sui dynasty in 581 CE, followed by the Tang dynasty in 618 CE. The Tang era would become one of the Silk Road's golden ages. The Tang capital, Chang'an, grew into one of the largest and most cosmopolitan cities in the world. Its markets teemed with foreign merchants, Sogdians with distinctive dress and deep-set eyes, Persians bearing silverware, Indians offering spices and medicines. Government policy under the early Tang emperors favored expansion and engagement. Military campaigns secured control over key stretches of the Tarim Basin, re-establishing Chinese influence in Central Asia. Under Tang rule, the Silk Road flourished not only economically, but culturally. Poetry from the era reflects awareness of distant lands. Court musicians incorporated Central Asian melodies. Foreign religions enjoyed relative tolerance. Nestorian Christianity established a presence in Chang'an, commemorated in a famous stele erected in 781 CE that recorded the faith's arrival and imperial recognition. Yet even in this era of brilliance, fragility remained. The very openness that enriched Tang society also exposed it to turbulence. In the mid-8th century, the An-Lushan rebellion erupted, led by a general of mixed Sogdian and Turkic heritage. The rebellion devastated large swathes of northern China and weakened Tang authority. Control over Central Asian territories wavered. To the west, another transformative force was rising: Islam. In the 7th century, the Arabian Peninsula witnessed the emergence of a new monotheistic faith under the Prophet Muhammad. Within decades of his death in 632 CE, Arab armies expanded outward with remarkable speed. The Sasanian Empire fell, and large portions of the Byzantine eastern provinces came under Muslim rule. As Islamic caliphates consolidated power, they inherited and reshaped segments of the Silk Road network. Under the Umayyad and later the Abbasid caliphates, cities such as Baghdad became centers of learning and commerce. The Abbasid capital, founded in 762 CE, lay strategically positioned near older trade arteries, linking Mesopotamia to Persia and beyond. Islamic governance often facilitated trade by standardizing taxation and ensuring relative security across vast territories. Muslim merchants traveled widely, and Arabic became an important lingua franca across portions of the network. Islam spread not only by conquest, but through trade. In Central Asia, merchants and Sufi missionaries gradually introduced Islamic teachings. Conversion was often gradual, blending older traditions with new beliefs. Over centuries, many regions along the Silk Road would become predominantly Muslim, transforming the religious landscape yet again. In this period, the Silk Road became a conduit for scientific and technological transmission as well. Paper, invented in China during the Han Dynasty, began moving westward after Chinese papermakers were captured during the Battle of Talas in 751 CE between Tang forces and the Abbasid Caliphate. Papermaking techniques spread into the Islamic world and eventually into Europe, revolutionizing record-keeping and scholarship. The road that carried silk also carried the tools that would one day democratize knowledge. Disease, too, traveled these corridors. Though the most devastating pandemic associated with the Silk Road, the Black Death, would come centuries later, earlier outbreaks likely moved along trade routes. Connectivity amplified vulnerability. What bound societies together also exposed them to shared catastrophe. As the first millennium drew toward its close, the Silk Road had become less a novelty and more a fact of life across Eurasia. Generations had grown up in cities shaped by its rhythms. Caravans departing at dawn were as ordinary as market bells. Yet beneath the surface of routine lay immense transformation. Religions had crossed deserts, scripts had migrated, artistic motifs had fused. The map of belief across Eurasia had been redrawn not by a single conqueror, but by countless journeys. The Silk Road was no longer merely a thread of commerce. It was an artery of civilization. Empires rose and claimed it. Empires fell and lost it. But the deeper current, the human hunger to exchange, to learn, to seek advantage and meaning beyond one's birthplace, continued. In the centuries ahead, new conquerors from the steppe would harness this network with unprecedented scale. They would unify vast territories under a single dominion, briefly rendering the Silk Road safer than ever before. Yet that unity would come through fire and fear before it yielded prosperity. For now, at the close of this era, the road lay open but unsettled. Faiths coexisted in tension and dialogue. Markets hummed under watchful walls. Across deserts lit by cold stars, caravans pressed onward, unaware that the next great transformation was already gathering momentum beyond the horizon. In the early 13th century, the Silk Road stood at once diminished and alive. It had endured fragmentation, regional wars, shifting dynasties, and the slow redirection of some trade toward maritime routes. Yet caravans still crossed the Taklamakan's rim. Merchants still passed through Samarkand's gates. Pilgrims still traced mountain paths worn smooth by centuries of devotion. The network remained vast, but it was fractured, controlled in pieces by rival states who taxed, guarded, and sometimes preyed upon it. Beyond the settled lands, however, on the sweeping grasslands of Mongolia, a force was gathering that would alter the Silk Road more dramatically than any empire before it. The steppe had always produced confederations of mounted warriors. The Xiongnu had troubled Han China. The Turks had shaped Central Asian politics. Countless tribes had risen and dissolved into the horizon. The steppe was not a wilderness, but a distinct ecological and cultural world. Its inhabitants depended on herds, horses above all, and on mobility. Their political structures were fluid, based on loyalty, kinship, and charisma. To sedentary empires, they could appear as raiders from nowhere. In truth, they were participants in the same Eurasian system, trading animals, furs, and military service for grain, textiles, and luxury goods. Around 1206, a man named Temujin unified many of the Mongol tribes under his leadership and took the title Genghis Khan. His rise was neither accidental nor purely brutal. It was rooted in a reorganization of steppe society. He broke the power of traditional aristocracies, promoted men based on loyalty and ability, and forged a disciplined military structure. His armies were built around units of tens, hundreds, and thousands, bound by strict codes and swift communication. What distinguished the Mongol expansion was not only ferocity, but speed. Mounted archers, hardened by life on the steppe, could travel extraordinary distances. They coordinated through signal flags and relay riders. They carried minimal baggage, living off herds and the land. Against fortified cities, they employed siege engineers, often conscripted from conquered peoples. Within decades, Mongol forces would conquer a territory stretching from northern China to the edges of Eastern Europe. At first, their campaigns were devastating. Cities that resisted were annihilated. Entire populations were massacred to instill terror and discourage defiance. The Khwarezmian Empire in Central Asia, which had controlled major Silk Road cities such as Bukhara and Samarkand, fell under Mongol assault after diplomatic conflict escalated into war. Chronicles describe flames rising above domes, irrigation systems destroyed, markets silenced. Yet within this destruction lay an unexpected transformation. The Mongols were not interested in ruling empty lands. They needed revenue, tribute, and trade. Once resistance was crushed, they often restored and protected commercial life. Skilled artisans were spared and relocated. Administrators were retained. The Mongol leadership understood the value of the Silk Road not merely as plunder, but as infrastructure. After Genghis Khan's death in 1227, his empire was divided among his sons and grandsons into Khanates: the Yuan dynasty in China under Kublai Khan, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Golden Horde in the Western Steppe and parts of Eastern Europe. Though politically distinct, these realms shared a Mongol heritage and maintained diplomatic ties. For a period in the 13th and early 14th centuries, much of Eurasia came under what historians call the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol Peace. Under this vast umbrella, the Silk Road experienced one of its most secure and integrated phases. Caravan routes were patrolled. Banditry was harshly punished. Relay stations known as yam were established across enormous distances, allowing official envoys to travel with unprecedented speed. A merchant bearing a Mongol paisa, a tablet granting authority and protection, could pass through multiple territories with relative safety. For the first time in history, it became possible to traverse from the shores of the Pacific to the plains of Hungary, largely under a single overarching political order. This did not eliminate local dangers or rivalries, but it reduced the fragmentation that had previously hindered long-distance trade. The Mongol rulers were religiously pragmatic, though many eventually converted to Islam or Buddhism, depending on region. Early Mongol policy favored tolerance. In cities like Karakorum and later Khanbalik, known to Europeans as Kambaluk and today as Beijing, temples, mosques, churches, and monasteries stood within the same urban sphere. Foreign administrators, including Persians and Central Asians, served in the Yuan court in China. The Silk Road became not only safer, but more cosmopolitan. It was in this context that one of the most famous travelers in Silk Road history undertook his journey. In the late 13th century, a Venetian merchant named Marco Polo traveled with his father and uncle across Asia to the court of Kublai Khan. Though scholars debate aspects of his account, his narrative introduced European audiences to detailed descriptions of China's cities, wealth, paper money, and customs. His book, later known as The Travels of Marco Polo, shaped European imagination for centuries. But Marco Polo was not unique. Muslim travelers such as Ibn Battuta journeyed widely across the Islamic world and beyond in the 14th century, documenting encounters with Mongol courts and Central Asian cities. Nestorian Christian monks moved between East and West. Persian astronomers served in Chinese observatories. The movement of people under Mongol rule intensified cultural exchange on a scale not previously seen. Goods traveled in increasing volume. Silk, porcelain, and tea moved westward, horses, precious metals, textiles, and glassware moved eastward. Gunpowder technology, already developed in China, began to diffuse more widely across Eurasia. The compass and printing techniques gradually spread. Crops such as citrus fruits and varieties of rice shifted between regions. Knowledge of medicine and astronomy circulated in both directions. Yet the same interconnectedness that fostered prosperity also carried invisible danger. In the mid-14th century, a pandemic erupted that would devastate Eurasia. Known later as the Black Death, it likely originated in Central Asia, possibly among rodent populations in steppe regions. The bacterium Yersinia pestis travelled via fleas, on rats that accompanied caravans and ships. As trade intensified under Mongol integration, so too did the speed of contagion. By the 1340s, plague had reached the Black Sea ports. From there, it spread into the Mediterranean and across Europe, killing perhaps a third to half of the population in some regions. It also struck the Middle East and parts of Asia. The Silk Road, which had enabled an unprecedented era of connection, became a conduit for catastrophe. The demographic collapse disrupted trade networks. Labor shortages reshaped economies. Fear altered patterns of movement. Mongol political unity itself began to fracture under internal rivalries and external pressures. In China, the Yuan dynasty faced rebellion and economic strain. By 1368, it was overthrown by the Ming dynasty. In Persia, the Ilkhanate disintegrated. The Golden Horde weakened amid succession disputes. As Mongol authority declined, the Silk Road's relative security diminished. Regional powers reasserted control. In Central Asia, the conqueror Timur, known in the West as Tamerlane, rose in the late 14th century, claiming descent from the Mongols and seeking to revive imperial grandeur. His campaigns were brutal, leaving cities destroyed, yet also patronizing architecture and scholarship in Samarkand, which he made his capital. Trade revived in pockets, but never fully regained the seamless integration of the early Pax Mongolica. Meanwhile, maritime trade routes were growing increasingly competitive. Advances in shipbuilding and navigation allowed merchants to move goods by sea between East Asia, Southeast Asia, India, the Middle East, and eventually Europe, with greater efficiency for certain commodities. Overland caravans remained vital for specific regions and goods, but the balance was shifting. The Mongol era stands as a paradox in Silk Road history. It began in fire and ended in fragmentation, yet in between it achieved a level of transcontinental coherence unmatched before or since. Ideas, technologies, religions, and diseases crossed Eurasia with startling speed. The world became, in a sense, smaller. In the quiet after conquest, one can imagine a caravan setting out from a city newly rebuilt under Mongol oversight. The markets have reopened. The yam station awaits fresh horses. A merchant secures his paisa and joins others at dawn. Among the goods are bolts of silk, sacks of spices, ingots of silver, manuscripts carefully wrapped in cloth. The road ahead stretches thousands of miles, but it is no longer divided by hostile frontiers at every turn. For a fleeting century, the Silk Road achieved something close to unity. Yet unity born of conquest is fragile. When the great Khans were gone and their descendants quarreled, the vast web loosened once more. Caravans would continue, as they always had, adapting to new rulers and new risks. But the age when one empire's authority spanned from the Pacific to the fringes of Europe would not return. The storm from the steppe had reshaped the Silk Road forever. It had demonstrated both the power of integration and the peril that travels with it. And as the 15th century approached, a new transformation, this time from the sea, was preparing to draw global trade onto different currents, leaving the ancient overland arteries to fade gradually into memory. When the Mongol order fractured in the late 14th century, the Silk Road did not collapse in a single moment. It dimmed gradually, like embers settling after a vast fire. Caravans still departed from Samarkand. Traders still crossed the Pamirs. But something fundamental had shifted in the balance of the world. The Ming dynasty rose in China in 1368 after overthrowing the Yuan. Its founder, the Mongol Emperor, sought stability after decades of rebellion and plague. Suspicious of foreign influence and determined to consolidate internal control, the early Ming rulers reoriented China inward. The costly military campaigns required to maintain influence deep in Central Asia no longer seemed worthwhile. Garrisons were withdrawn from some Western territories. Official engagement along portions of the Silk Road lessened. Yet paradoxically, while overland engagement diminished, maritime ambition briefly surged. Under the Mongol Emperor in the early 15th century, enormous treasure fleets commanded by the Admiral Zheng had sailed across the South China Sea and into the Indian Ocean. These voyages projected Ming prestige as far as Southeast Asia, India, Arabia, and the east coast of Africa. They were not exploratory in the European sense, but diplomatic and commercial missions meant to reinforce tributary relationships. The scale of these fleets was staggering, ships dwarfing anything seen in Europe at the time. They carried silks, porcelain, and lacquerware outward, returning with exotic goods, animals, and envoys. For a moment, it seemed that China might pivot decisively toward maritime dominance. But after Zheng He's final voyage in 1433, the court abruptly curtailed large-scale naval expeditions. Political factions argued that the voyages were extravagant and unnecessary. Resources were redirected toward defending the northern frontier against renewed steppe threats. Shipbuilding regulations tightened. Maritime trade continued, but without the same state sponsorship. Meanwhile, in Central Asia, the Timurid Empire, under Timur and his successors, had attempted to revive Silk Road cities as centers of art and commerce. Samarkand blossomed with blue-tiled madrasas and monumental architecture. Scholars, artisans, and astronomers gathered at court. Yet Timurid unity proved short-lived. After Timur's death in 1405, succession struggles fragmented his empire. Trade persisted, but political coherence eroded. Further west, another power was consolidating control over critical nodes of exchange: the Ottoman Empire. By the mid-15th century, the Ottomans had captured Constantinople in 1453, transforming it into Istanbul. With this conquest, they secured a strategic bridge between Europe and Asia. Ottoman authority extended across Anatolia, the Levant, and parts of southeastern Europe, encompassing key overland and maritime corridors linking east and west. European states, particularly the Italian city-states such as Venice and Genoa, had long traded with the eastern Mediterranean, importing spices, silk, and luxury goods that had traveled overland or by sea from Asia. With Ottoman expansion, access did not disappear, but it became more tightly controlled and often more expensive. Customs duties rose. Political tensions complicated commerce. It is tempting to portray this moment as a sudden closing of the Silk Road that forced Europe to seek alternatives. The reality was subtler. Trade continued through Ottoman domains, but European merchants and rulers increasingly desired direct access to Asian goods, especially spices from the Indian Ocean world, without reliance on multiple intermediaries. Thus, while caravans still wound through the passes of Central Asia, a new set of routes was being imagined along the coasts of the Atlantic. In 1492, Christopher Columbus sailed westward under the Spanish crown. Seeking a sea route to Asia, he did not find the markets of Cathay or the courts described by Marco Polo. Instead, he encountered continents previously unknown to Europeans. A few years later, in 1498, the Portuguese navigator Vasco da Gama successfully rounded the Cape of Good Hope and reached India by sea, establishing a direct maritime link between Europe and the Indian Ocean trade network. The consequences were profound. Maritime routes could carry bulk goods more cheaply and in greater volume than overland caravans. Ships could transport spices, textiles, and precious metals across oceans without the need to traverse multiple political frontiers. European naval powers gradually inserted themselves into existing Indian Ocean systems, sometimes violently, sometimes through negotiation. Over the 16th century, global trade patterns increasingly shifted toward these sea lanes. Silver mined in the Americas flowed to Europe and then onward to Asia, particularly to China, where it was in high demand. Manila became a critical hub, linking Spanish America to East Asia via the Pacific. The world's economic center of gravity was tilting outward from the ancient caravan cities toward coastal ports. This did not mean that the Silk Road vanished overnight. In Central Asia, local trade remained vital. Regional caravans connected agricultural zones with urban markets. Silk, horses, carpets, and manuscripts still changed hands along time-worn paths. But the grand transcontinental role of the overland network diminished. Political fragmentation also took its toll. The Safavid Empire emerged in Persia in the early 16th century, promoting Shia Islam as state doctrine and competing with the Sunni Ottoman Empire to the west and the Uzbek Khanates to the northeast. Warfare between these powers disrupted segments of the overland routes. Security could no longer be assumed across vast distances, as it had been briefly under the Mongols. In China, the Ming dynasty maintained limited overland trade through regulated border markets. Later, under the Qing dynasty, beginning in the 17th century, expansion into Xinjiang re-established firmer control over parts of the old Silk Road corridors. Yet by then, the global system had transformed. European maritime empires, Portuguese, Spanish, Dutch, and later British, were weaving a new web across oceans. And yet, something of the Silk Road endured beyond economics. Cultural memories persisted in architecture, in languages infused with borrowed words, in culinary traditions shaped by centuries of exchange. The diffusion of paper had already revolutionized scholarship across Eurasia. The transmission of gunpowder would reshape warfare globally. Artistic motifs that originated in one civilization had long ago taken root in another. Even as caravans grew fewer, the idea of connection remained. Travelers in the 17th and 18th centuries still crossed Central Asia, though often under more hazardous conditions. Jesuit missionaries journeyed to China. Muslim scholars traveled between Central Asian madrasas and Ottoman centers of learning. Merchants continued to link regional economies, even if the scale was reduced. By the 19th century, the term Silk Road itself had not yet been coined. It was a later creation, popularized by the German geographer Ferdinand von Richthofen in the 1870s. He used the phrase Seidenstraße to describe the network of trade routes that had connected China with the Mediterranean in antiquity. The name captured imagination, though it simplified a far more complex reality. Ironically, as European powers expanded across Asia in the Age of Empire, they rediscovered fragments of the ancient routes. Explorers and archaeologists uncovered manuscripts in desert caves, unearthed buried cities in the sands of the Taklamakan, and studied the faded murals of Dunhuang. What had once been living arteries of commerce became subjects of scholarly fascination. The turning of the tides had not erased the Silk Road. It had transformed its significance. Once the central spine of Eurasian exchange, it became a historical memory, overshadowed by global maritime empires. Yet the patterns it established, long-distance trade, cultural hybridity, the blending of faiths and technologies, laid the foundation for the interconnected world that followed. As the 15th and 16th centuries unfolded, humanity entered a new phase of globalization, this time driven by sails and cannons rather than camel caravans. But the sea routes did not emerge from nothing. They were built upon centuries of accumulated knowledge about distant lands. Knowledge first transmitted along the Silk Road. The old road did not end in a single year. It faded, rerouted, adapted. In mountain passes, hoofprints still marked the snow. In oasis towns, markets still opened at dawn. Yet the center of gravity had shifted. The Silk Road had shaped the world. Now the world was moving beyond it. Long after the great caravans had thinned and the maritime empires had redrawn the maps of commerce, the Silk Road lingered in fragments, half-buried walls, weathered stupas, stories told in markets that no longer faced the same horizons. The desert is patient. It does not erase in haste. It covers, preserves, and waits. By the 18th and 19th centuries, Central Asia had become a frontier of imperial rivalry. The Russian Empire expanded steadily southward across the steppe, absorbing Khanates and pressing towards the borders of Persia, Afghanistan, and Western China. The British Empire, entrenched in India, viewed Russian movement with suspicion. What followed became known as the Great Game, a strategic contest for influence across Central Asia. In this atmosphere of espionage, diplomacy, and mapping, the ancient Silk Road corridors regained geopolitical significance. They were no longer the primary arteries of global trade, but they were strategic routes across contested terrain. Surveyors, soldiers, and spies traversed passes once walked by monks and merchants. Yet alongside political maneuvering came something quieter, but equally transformative. Exploration driven by scholarship and curiosity. European, Russian, Japanese, and Chinese explorers ventured into the deserts of Xinjiang and the oases of the Tarim Basin, seeking traces of lost civilizations. Many were motivated by the expanding disciplines of archaeology and philology. Others sought glory, national prestige, or rare manuscripts that could illuminate early religious history. Among these explorers was Aurel Stein, a Hungarian-British archaeologist who conducted several expeditions into Chinese Central Asia in the early 20th century. Traveling with caravans and local guides, Stein navigated the Taklamakan's shifting dunes and excavated sites long swallowed by sand. At places like Nia and Lulan, he uncovered wooden tablets inscribed in ancient scripts, textiles preserved by arid air, and everyday objects that revealed the intimate texture of Silk Road life. The desert had preserved what humidity would have destroyed. Documents written in languages once spoken in the Oasis kingdoms, Sogdian, Khotanese, Tocharian, emerged into daylight after centuries of silence. Some texts were mundane, contracts, tax records, personal letters. Others were sacred, Buddhist sutras, fragments of Christian liturgy, Manichaean hymns. Together, they testified to a cosmopolitan world far richer and more complex than the simplified image of a single road. Perhaps the most famous discovery occurred near Dunhuang, at the Mogao Caves. In 1900, a Taoist monk named Wang Yuanlu uncovered a sealed cave filled with tens of thousands of manuscripts, paintings, and textiles. The cache had been hidden in the 11th century, possibly to protect it from invasion. When explorers like Stein and the French scholar Paul Pelliot learned of the find, they acquired significant portions of the manuscripts and transported them to institutions in London and Paris. The manuscripts from Dunhuang revealed a multilingual, multi-religious society. Texts in Chinese, Tibetan, Sanskrit, Sogdian, and Uyghur lay side by side. They included Buddhist scriptures, Christian documents from the Church of the East, administrative records, and even popular literature. The cave library was a time capsule of Silk Road civilization at its height. Modern scholars would later debate the ethics of these removals, questioning the imbalance of power between foreign explorers and local custodians. Yet the discoveries undeniably expanded global understanding of the Silk Road's cultural depth. What had once been dismissed as a mere trade route emerged as a corridor of ideas, art, and intellectual exchange. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, technological change once again altered the Silk Road landscape. Railways extended into Central Asia under Russian rule. Telegraph lines cut across territories where messages had once taken months to travel by caravan. Steamships dominated maritime trade. The old rhythms of camel caravans seemed increasingly antiquated. Political upheavals further reshaped the region. The Qing dynasty in China collapsed in 1911, leading to Republican revolution and later decades of internal conflict. The Russian Empire fell in 1917, replaced by the Soviet Union, which consolidated control over Central Asian republics. Borders hardened. Cross-border movement became more regulated. Some traditional trade patterns were severed entirely. Yet even amid ideological and industrial transformation, the memory of the Silk Road gained new symbolic power. Scholars wrote histories tracing the ancient exchanges between East and West. Museums displayed artifacts recovered from desert ruins. The very phrase Silk Road began to capture public imagination as a romantic image of caravans beneath endless skies. This romanticism often smoothed away hardship. It glossed over the thirst, the banditry, the political tension, the labor of pack animals and porters, but it also reflected something genuine, a recognition that long before modern globalization, Eurasian societies had been intertwined. The 20th century brought further disruption. Wars scarred continents. Revolutions redrew political maps. For decades, much of Central Asia remained relatively closed to Western researchers. The Cold War cast its own shadow across ancient roots. And yet, quietly, scholarship continued. Chinese archaeologists conducted systematic excavations in Xinjiang and Gansu. Soviet researchers studied Sogdian inscriptions and mapped ancient irrigation systems. Linguists reconstructed extinct languages from fragile fragments. As the late 20th century approached, another transformation unfolded. Globalization accelerated through digital communication, container shipping, and air travel. The speed and scale of exchange dwarfed anything imagined in the age of caravans. But the concept of connectivity, of continents linked by trade and culture, felt strikingly familiar. In 2013, the Chinese government announced a vast infrastructure and investment initiative known as the Belt and Road Initiative, explicitly invoking the legacy of the Silk Road. Railways, highways, pipelines and ports were proposed across Asia, Africa and Europe, intended to deepen economic integration. The historical Silk Road became not only a subject of academic study, but a political and economic symbol. Critics debated the initiative's strategic implications, debt structures, and geopolitical ambitions. Supporters emphasized development and connectivity. Regardless of perspective, the revival of Silk Road imagery underscored its enduring resonance. The ancient network had become a metaphor for global interdependence. Meanwhile, tourism began to reshape some of the old caravan cities. Samarkand's blue domes gleamed under restoration. Visitors walked through the Mogao caves under careful conservation measures. Kashgar's old town, though altered by modern development, remained a focal point of cultural memory. The Silk Road's rediscovery was not merely archaeological, it was intellectual. Scholars increasingly understood that history had rarely been isolated. Technologies such as papermaking, printing, and gunpowder had crossed boundaries centuries before European expansion. Religious traditions had migrated, adapted, and hybridized along the caravan routes. Even culinary habits, noodles, dumplings, spices, bore traces of ancient exchange. The desert cities beneath the sand were not ruins of a failed experiment. They were reminders that connection has always been a human constant. What changes is the medium: camel caravan, sailing ship, steam locomotive, fiber optic cable. Standing at the edge of the Taklamakan today, one might see highways replacing caravan tracks, trucks replacing camels. Yet the geography remains. The mountains still guard their passes. The wind still reshapes the dunes. Beneath the surface lie layers of human movement. Footsteps upon footsteps, centuries deep. The Silk Road did not end. It transformed into memory, into metaphor, into infrastructure of another kind. Its cities, once buried, now speak again through scholarship and preservation. Its artifacts sit in museums thousands of miles from where they were made, silent witnesses to journeys long completed. And in the quiet halls, where those artifacts are displayed, one can sense the vastness of the story. A network that carried silk and scripture, plague and paper, ambition and belief across a continent. The road was never a single path. It was an unfolding conversation across time. Let us step backward in time, not to emperors or conquerors, not to courts or collapsing dynasties, but to the ground itself, to the dust beneath hooves, to the slow rhythm of a caravan at dawn. It is the 8th century, during the height of the Tang dynasty. Chang'an awakens beneath pale morning light. The city is immense, its grid of avenues carefully ordered, its markets already murmuring with languages from across Eurasia. In the Western Market District, foreign merchants gather among bolts of silk, lacquerware, ceramics, spices, carved jade, and bundles of paper. The air smells faintly of horse sweat, incense, and frying dough. Our caravan is forming. The caravan master, a Sogdian merchant whose family has traded this route for generations, oversees the loading. His beard is trimmed neatly, his robe practical but well made. He speaks Sogdian at home, Chinese in the markets, and enough Persian and Turkic to bargain across frontiers. Around him move assistants, camel drivers, guards. The animals groan softly as wooden frames are secured over their humps. The goods are carefully balanced. Silk bolts wrapped in oiled cloth to protect from moisture. Tea compressed into bricks. Paper stacked in tight bundles. Small lacquered boxes containing pigments and medicines. A few pieces of fine porcelain intended for elite buyers far to the west. In exchange, the caravan hopes to return with silver, horses, spices, glassware, perhaps even rare manuscripts. Departure is never hurried. Contracts have been written, taxes paid, travel, permits secured from Tang officials. The caravan waits for favourable weather. Finally, at sunrise, the gates open. The first days pass through cultivated land. Wheat fields ripple under wind. Villages cluster around irrigation canals. Travellers share the road. Farmers driving carts. Monks seeking alms. Soldiers marching between garrisons. Gradually, the land narrows into the Hexi corridor, the vital artery leading toward the desert. Beacon towers stand watch along ridges, signals of imperial authority. At night, the caravan circles the camels inward, forming a living wall against theft. Fires are kept small. Guards rotate in quiet vigilance. The desert sky reveals stars so sharp and numerous that even seasoned traders sometimes pause in silence. Beyond the Jade Gate, the world changes. The Taklamakan desert stretches vast and unforgiving. The caravan will not cross it directly. That would be suicide. Instead, they follow the northern rim, moving from oasis to oasis, like beads on a string. Each oasis city feels like a miracle. Turfan appears as a patch of green sustained by underground irrigation channels called kares. Grapevines flourish here. Raisins are traded in woven baskets. The inhabitants speak a language unfamiliar to Chinese ears. Buddhist temples stand beside local shrines. The caravan rests, replenishes water skins, purchases fresh animals if needed. Life within the caravan settles into rhythm. Before dawn, camels are loaded. By mid-morning, the heat intensifies. Faces are wrapped against dust. Conversations are sparse while walking, saved for rest stops. Stories emerge at night. Tales of past journeys. Rumours of political unrest farther west. Accounts of bandits along certain stretches. Danger is constant but unpredictable. Sometimes it comes as sandstorms that blot out the horizon, forcing the caravan to halt and kneel the camels until the wind subsides. Sometimes it appears as mounted raiders testing the caravan's defences. The guards carry bows and spears. Negotiations may avert violence, but readiness is essential. In Kucha, music drifts through the streets. Kucha is known for its musicians, whose melodies have influenced even the Tang court. Painted cave temples depict scenes from the life of the Buddha, rendered in colours that glow against rock walls. monks offer blessings to travelers in exchange for donations. The caravan master leaves a small gift, both pious and practical, ensuring goodwill for future journeys. Further west lies Kashgar, a crucial crossroads where northern and southern desert routes converge before climbing toward the Pamirs. Here, the diversity intensifies. Traders from India arrive with spices and cotton textiles. Persian merchants display silver vessels chased with intricate designs. Turkic nomads trade horses, bred for endurance. The marketplace hums in multiple tongues. In Kashgar, goods may change hands without traveling the entire distance. A bolt of silk from Chang'an might be sold here to a Persian intermediary, who will carry it onward to Samarkand. The Silk Road is rarely a single continuous journey. It is a chain of transactions. Still, our caravan presses on. The ascent into the Pamirs tests men and animals alike. Paths narrow to ledges carved into mountain faces. Snow lingers in shaded passes even in summer. The caravan must move carefully, spacing animals to avoid rockfalls. Breathing grows laboured at altitude. Yet beyond the peaks lies the fertile valley of Sogdiana. Samarkand rises like a vision, its markets broad, its walls formidable. Here, the caravan master is at home. He negotiates in his native tongue. Contracts are reviewed. Silk is examined for quality. Some goods are sold, others repacked for further travel. News circulates rapidly in these hubs. Reports from Baghdad, from Constantinople, from distant India. Samarkand is not merely a trading post, but a cultural furnace. Zoroastrian fire temples burn beside Buddhist monasteries. Christian communities worship quietly. Artistic motifs blend Persian elegance with Central Asian colour. Children grow up hearing stories of lands they may never see, but feel connected to nonetheless. From here, part of the caravan may continue westward under new partners. Crossing into Persian lands, travellers encounter administrative systems shaped by centuries of empire. Caravanserais appear at regular intervals, rectangular enclosures with a single fortified gate, a courtyard for animals, and small rooms for merchants. These inns are lifelines, offering water, food, and protection. As the caravan approaches Mesopotamia, the climate shifts. Date palms line riverbanks. Cities like Baghdad dazzle with libraries and scholars debating philosophy, medicine, and astronomy. Paper from China has transformed record-keeping. Manuscripts circulate widely. Here, silk is no longer exotic, but integrated into elite fashion. Some goods will continue onward toward the eastern Mediterranean. They may pass through Aleppo or Antioch, eventually reaching ports where ships carry them into Byzantine or Italian hands. By the time a Roman or Venetian noble touches the silk, it has changed owners many times. The caravan's return journey differs. Westward goods are loaded. Silver coins, glassware, perhaps war horses prized by Chinese generals. Spices from India that arrived via southern routes may also be included. The risks remain, but familiarity breeds resilience. Months stretch into a year. When at last the caravan nears Chang'an again, its members are altered. They have crossed climates and languages, witnessed unfamiliar rituals, tasted foods unknown at departure. They have navigated negotiation and danger, boredom and awe. Within the Tang capital, their arrival barely causes a ripple. Caravans come and go continually, yet each journey is a thread in the immense tapestry of exchange. The Silk Road, at ground level, is not abstract. It is blistered feet, cracked lips, ledgers inked by lamplight. It is the patient chewing of camels at dusk. It is children watching strangers enter their oasis town, wondering what distant world they represent. Empires may rise and fall above this rhythm. Dynasties may rename cities, but the caravan endures as long as there is profit to be made and curiosity to be satisfied. And in that endurance lies the true spirit of the Silk Road, not in grand proclamations, but in the steady courage of those who walk it. Long before maps could be printed in thousands, before borders were traced in ink and sealed with treaties, there were individuals who walked into the unknown, guided not by profit or conquest, but by faith. If merchants were the arteries of the Silk Road, then pilgrims were its quiet pulse. They moved more slowly, often more vulnerably, yet their journeys reshaped civilizations just as profoundly as caravans laden with silk. It is one thing to cross a desert for silver. It is another to cross it for truth. In the early centuries of the Common Era, as Buddhism expanded beyond the Indian subcontinent, monks began following the trade arteries northward. They did not travel alone. They moved with caravans, sharing provisions and dangers. The road that carried silk proved equally capable of carrying sutras. Yet for these pilgrims, the journey was not transactional. It was devotional. One of the most remarkable of these travelers was Faxian, a Chinese monk who departed in the early 5th century during a time of political fragmentation in China. Disturbed by incomplete monastic rules and inconsistencies in scripture, he resolved to travel to India, the land of the Buddha, to obtain authentic texts. His decision was radical. The route ahead was perilous, and he was no longer young. He passed through the Gobi Desert, describing the landscape as a place where there are neither birds above nor beasts below. Travelers relied on the bones of previous caravans to mark the path. He crossed oasis kingdoms where Buddhism had already taken root, stopping at monasteries supported by merchant wealth. He continued across the Pamirs and into the fertile regions of northern India. Years passed before he returned home, carrying manuscripts that would influence Chinese Buddhism for generations. His journey was not an isolated act of devotion. It was part of a larger current flowing eastward and westward alike. In the 7th century, during the Tang dynasty's height, another monk named Xuanzang undertook an even more ambitious pilgrimage. Dissatisfied with prevailing interpretations of Buddhist doctrine, he left Chang'an secretly, defying imperial restrictions on foreign travel. He crossed the deserts and mountains with extraordinary resilience, documenting the geography, politics, and cultures of the regions he encountered. His accounts later provided historians with invaluable descriptions of Central Asian kingdoms. Xuanzang studied for years at the Great Indian Monastic University of Nalanda before returning to China with hundreds of texts and relics. Upon his arrival, he was received with honor. He spent the remainder of his life translating scriptures, shaping the development of East Asian Buddhism. His pilgrimage symbolized the Silk Road's spiritual dimension, a road not merely of goods, but of intellectual transformation. Yet Buddhism was not alone upon these paths. As Christianity spread eastward beyond the Roman world, communities associated with the Church of the East established themselves in Persia and Central Asia. By the 7th century, Christian missionaries had reached China. A stone stele erected in Chang'an in 781 recorded the arrival of what it called the luminous religion during the Tang era. The inscription describes scriptures translated into Chinese, monasteries constructed with imperial approval, and theological concepts rendered in the language of Confucian and Taoist philosophy. These Christians adapted to survive. They adopted local vocabulary. They wore clothing indistinguishable from their neighbors. The Silk Road required flexibility. Survival depended on it. Manichaeism, born in 3rd century Persia under the prophet Mani, traveled even more widely. Mani envisioned his religion as a synthesis of earlier traditions, a final revelation uniting elements of Christianity, Zoroastrianism, and Buddhism. His followers were zealous missionaries, moving along trade networks into Central Asia and China. Though often persecuted by established authorities, they established communities that endured for centuries. Then came Islam. In the 7th century, Arab armies expanded rapidly across the Middle East and Persia. Yet Islam's spread along the Silk Road was not solely the result of conquest. Merchants played an essential role. Muslim traders, known for their contractual ethics and commercial reliability, formed diasporic communities in Central Asian cities. Over generations, conversion often followed familiarity. Sufi mystics contributed profoundly to Islam's expansion in these regions. Their emphasis on personal devotion and spiritual experience resonated deeply within culturally diverse societies. They established lodges that welcomed travelers, blending scholarship with hospitality. Through trade and spiritual charisma alike, Islam gradually became dominant across much of Central Asia. In caravanserais at dusk, conversations unfolded that could not have been imagined in more isolated worlds. A Buddhist monk might sit beside a Muslim trader. A Christian scribe might exchange stories with a Zoroastrian priest. Disagreement existed, certainly. So did debate. But proximity fostered awareness. Religious art along the Silk Road bears witness to this blending. In the caves of Dunhuang, haloed figures resemble Indian bodhisattvas, yet carry stylistic traces of Persian and even Hellenistic influence. In Central Asian Christian manuscripts, decorative motifs echo neighboring artistic traditions. The very act of translation required conceptual bridges, terms for heaven, enlightenment, salvation, rendered into new linguistic frameworks. Faith along the Silk Road was not static. It evolved. Consider the oasis town of Khotan. Once a stronghold of Buddhism, it thrived for centuries as a center of learning and manuscript production. Monasteries were sustained by merchant patronage. Yet over time, as Islam spread through the region, beginning in the 10th century, Khotan gradually transformed. Mosques rose where stupas had once dominated skylines. Conversion was neither instantaneous nor universally peaceful, but it reflected the shifting currents of power and culture. Pilgrims continued to travel even amid change. Muslim scholars journeyed to Mecca along routes that intersected with older Silk Road corridors. Jewish traders of the Radhanite network connected Europe and Asia, navigating both Christian and Muslim territories. Armenian merchants built vast commercial webs linking the Mediterranean to India. Faith required infrastructure just as commerce did. Monasteries and mosques provided lodging and protection for travelers. Religious endowments funded wells and bridges. Pilgrimage created predictable patterns of movement that merchants could mirror. Yet the Silk Road also tested belief. Deserts do not spare the devout. Sandstorms do not discriminate between the pious and the skeptical. Many pilgrims perished before reaching their destinations. Others were captured in conflicts between rival powers. Manuscripts were lost to weather and war. Still, they walked. What drove them was not naivete, but conviction that truth lay beyond familiar horizons. For Buddhist monks, India represented the sacred geography of awakening. For Muslims in Central Asia, the pilgrimage to Mecca connected them to a global ummah. For Christian missionaries, distant courts offered opportunities to expand spiritual community. Over centuries, these journeys altered theology itself. Exposure to different philosophies sharpened debate. Buddhist schools in China diverged from their Indian predecessors. Islamic scholarship absorbed Greek philosophical texts, preserved and transmitted along these same routes. Christianity in Asia developed liturgical forms distinct from those of Europe. The Silk Road was a crucible in which religions encountered one another without annihilating difference. Conflict occurred, but so did coexistence. Cities like Samarkand and Kashgar became layered landscapes of devotion, their skylines punctuated by domes, minarets, and temple roofs. When the Mongol Empire unified much of Eurasia in the 13th century, religious exchange intensified further. Mongol rulers often invited clerics of multiple faiths to court debates. Kublai Khan entertained Buddhist monks, Muslim scholars, and Christian representatives. Tolerance was pragmatic, yet it created unprecedented opportunities for interaction. But just as trade would eventually shift toward the seas, so too would religious centers of gravity. Overland pilgrimage declined as maritime routes expanded. Political fragmentation hardened borders. Some communities vanished under pressure or assimilation, yet their echoes remain. Today, fragments of Christian manuscripts found in Central Asian deserts testify to communities long gone. Buddhist cave paintings survive as fading color against stone. Sufi shrines still welcome visitors in towns once dominated by caravan trade. The spiritual dimension of the Silk Road did not vanish. It transformed and diffused. If one listens carefully, beyond the commerce and conquest, one can hear the softer footsteps of those who walked not for wealth, but for wisdom. They carried fewer goods, but their cargo reshaped minds and metaphysics. The Silk Road was not only a highway of silk, it was a corridor of revelation. Under cold desert stars, as caravans slept and embers dimmed, pilgrims sometimes prayed facing directions defined not by compass, but by conviction. The same wind that brushed their robes had touched countless travelers before them. The same horizons stretched indifferent and infinite, and still they walked. Not all cargo along the Silk Road could be weighed on a scale or wrapped in cloth. Some of the most transformative exchanges moved silently, without ceremony, carried in memory, in observation, in ink scratched onto fragile pages. If silk shimmered and spices perfumed the air, knowledge traveled without scent, without color, and yet with consequences far greater than any bale of fabric. Imagine a caravan arriving in Samarkand in the 8th century. Among its goods are bolts of silk and sacks of tea. But tucked between these tangible wares is something else, a technique, a craft, a process known only to a handful of artisans in distant China. Paper. Its invention during the Han Dynasty had already altered Chinese administration and literature, lighter and cheaper than silk, more practical than bamboo slips. Paper allowed records to multiply. Bureaucracy expanded with it. Poetry flourished upon it. knowledge could be copied and preserved with relative ease. For centuries, papermaking remained largely confined to East Asia. But in 751, near the Talas River in Central Asia, forces of the Tang dynasty clashed with the Abbasid Caliphate. The battle itself did not reshape empires in dramatic fashion, but in its aftermath, Chinese artisans skilled in papermaking were reportedly captured and brought westward. Whether the transfer occurred exactly as later chroniclers described, the result is clear. By the late 8th century, papermaking had taken root in the Islamic world. In cities like Samarkand and later Baghdad, paper mills emerged. The Islamic Golden Age, spanning roughly the 8th to the 13th centuries, depended in part on this technology. Scholars translated Greek philosophical texts into Arabic. Astronomers charted the heavens. Physicians compiled medical encyclopedias. The relative affordability of paper compared to parchment accelerated intellectual production. From the Islamic world, paper making spread gradually into Europe. By the 12th and 13th centuries, paper mills appeared in Spain and Italy. Over time, this quiet technological transfer would underpin the European Renaissance and, eventually, the printing revolution. Gunpowder followed a different path. Developed in China by alchemists seeking elixirs of immortality, gunpowder initially found use in fireworks and rudimentary military devices. Through contact along the Silk Road and during the Mongol expansions, knowledge of gunpowder weapons moved westward. By the 14th century, firearms and cannons were appearing in Middle Eastern and European warfare. This transformation altered the architecture of power. Fortified castles, once nearly impregnable, became vulnerable to artillery. States capable of producing and deploying gunpowder weapons gained strategic advantage. The political map of Eurasia shifted accordingly. The compass, too, traveled outward from China. Its early use in navigation allowed mariners to determine direction even when stars were obscured. As maritime trade expanded, especially during the age of European exploration, the compass became indispensable. Though sea routes eventually overshadowed overland caravans, the knowledge enabling those voyages had itself been transmitted across earlier networks of exchange. Mathematics and astronomy traversed the Silk Road in multiple directions. Indian numerals, including the concept of zero, moved westward through Islamic scholarship and eventually into Europe, becoming the foundation of modern mathematics. Persian and Arab astronomers built upon Greek models while incorporating Indian and Chinese observations. Instruments such as the astrolabe spread across regions, refining navigation and timekeeping. Medicine, too, was enriched through contact. Chinese herbal knowledge encountered Greco-Roman humoral theory via Islamic intermediaries. Medical texts circulated, sometimes translated and reinterpreted to fit local paradigms. Remedies were compared, debated, adapted. Agricultural products formed another category of invisible cargo. Crops traveled along trade routes, reshaping diets and economies. Citrus fruits moved from Southeast Asia and China westward. Grapes and alfalfa moved eastward. Techniques of irrigation, particularly underground channels in arid regions, diffused across Central Asia and beyond. Even artistic techniques migrated. The depiction of haloed figures in Buddhist art reflects Hellenistic influence transmitted eastward after Alexander the Great's campaigns centuries earlier. Textile patterns fused Persian geometry with Chinese motifs. Musical instruments crossed cultural boundaries, evolving in new environments. The Silk Road thus functioned as a vast laboratory of cross-pollination. Rarely was a technology adopted unchanged. Instead, it was translated into local conditions. Consider printing. Woodblock printing developed in China centuries before movable type appeared in Europe. Buddhist sutras were among the earliest printed texts. While printing did not immediately revolutionize Europe upon arrival, the eventual development of movable type by Johannes Gutenberg in the 15th century built upon the broader diffusion of paper-making and print culture across Eurasia. Each innovation traveled unevenly. Political stability, economic demand, and cultural openness influenced adoption. Some societies resisted foreign techniques, others embraced them eagerly. The Mongol Empire once again played a catalytic role. By unifying vast territories, it allowed artisans and scholars to move more freely. Persian astronomers served at the Yuan court in China. Chinese engineers contributed expertise in siegecraft across Central Asia. The exchange was not always voluntary. Sometimes it followed conquest, but it facilitated unprecedented interaction. Yet knowledge did not move only among elites. Caravan drivers learned survival techniques from desert dwellers. Metalworkers observed unfamiliar forging methods in distant markets. Farmers experimented with new crops introduced through trade. The Silk Road's invisible cargo permeated daily life as much as royal courts. There was also darker transmission. Diseases traveled the same routes as innovation. The Black Death of the 14th century demonstrated how interconnected Eurasia had become. Plague bacteria likely moved along trade networks from Central Asia to the Mediterranean. Fleas carried by rodents aboard caravans and ships spread infection into cities unprepared for such devastation. Mortality reshaped economies, labor systems, and social structures. In this sense, the Silk Road revealed a fundamental truth of connectivity. Exchange amplifies both creation and vulnerability. As centuries progressed and maritime empires rose, the overland Silk Road's prominence declined. Yet by then, its invisible cargo had already woven itself into the fabric of multiple civilizations. European exploration was facilitated by navigational tools and mathematical systems shaped by earlier exchanges. Islamic scholarship had flourished through access to paper and Greek texts, preserved and transmitted across Asia. Chinese administration had absorbed artistic and religious influences from India and Central Asia. The world that emerged from the medieval period was irreversibly interconnected. Standing in a modern library, one can trace a lineage backward through printed books to paper, to ink, to scripts carried by caravan. Observing fireworks illuminate a night sky, one might glimpse the distant echo of Chinese alchemy. Using a compass app on a phone, one touches the legacy of navigational discoveries that once guided sailors and traders. The Silk Road's most profound impact lies not in the luxury goods it conveyed, but in the habits of exchange it normalized. It demonstrated that no civilization develops in isolation. Even the most distant societies are porous to ideas. If one could gather all the invisible cargo that ever crossed those deserts, the equations, the prayers, the recipes, the engineering sketches, it would outweigh the silk many times over. The camels carried more than merchants understood. And when the caravans eventually dwindled, their legacy persisted in libraries, in laboratories, in the architecture of cities far removed from sand and steppe. The Silk Road's true treasure was knowledge. there is no single day when a great road falls silent. No proclamation echoes across deserts announcing that caravans will no longer pass. No final merchant locks the gate of a caravanserai and declares the age complete. Decline is softer than that. It arrives gradually, like wind reshaping dunes, grain by grain until the path is no longer visible. By the 15th century, the Silk Road's centrality had already begun to wane, though few at the time would have described it in such terms. Trade still flowed. Cities like Herat, Tabriz, and Kashgar remained vibrant. But the scale and direction of global exchange were shifting. The seas were becoming highways. The Portuguese arrival in the Indian Ocean at the close of the 15th century marked a turning point. Vasco da Gama's voyage to Calicut in 1498 demonstrated that Europe could reach Asian markets without traversing the complex chain of intermediaries that had defined overland trade for centuries. This did not immediately eliminate caravan commerce, but it introduced a powerful alternative. Maritime routes offered advantages difficult for land corridors to match. Ships could carry bulk goods, pepper, cinnamon, textiles, in volumes far exceeding what camels could bear. Costs per unit decreased. Though sea travel had its own dangers, storms, piracy, disease, it required fewer political negotiations across fragmented territories. European powers did not create Indian Ocean trade. They inserted themselves into an already sophisticated network linking East Africa, Arabia, India, Southeast Asia, and China. Muslim, Hindu, and Chinese merchants had long navigated monsoon winds, but European naval artillery altered the balance of power in key ports. Fortified trading posts allowed Portuguese, Dutch, and later British merchants to control choke points. Meanwhile, inland Asia faced new political realities. In the 16th century, the Safavid Empire consolidated control over Persia, promoting Shia Islam as state doctrine and frequently clashing with the Sunni Ottoman Empire to the west. Their rivalry destabilized portions of the overland trade corridors. To the north, Uzbek Khanates contested Central Asian territories, while the Mughal Empire rose in India under Babur, a Timurid descendant. These empires engaged in trade certainly. Silk from Persia remained prized. Carpets, manuscripts, and metalwork moved between courts. But prolonged warfare along borderlands made certain routes less predictable. In China, the Ming dynasty grappled with internal fiscal strain and renewed pressure from steppe confederations. While trade continued, especially through regulated tribute systems and private maritime commerce, the state's orientation did not prioritize deep Central Asian engagement in the way earlier dynasties had during their expansionist phases. Under the Qing dynasty, beginning in the mid-17th century, China reasserted authority over Xinjiang and stabilized segments of the old Silk Road. Yet by then, global trade patterns were firmly maritime. Silver from the Americas flowed into China via Manila and European intermediaries. Tea, porcelain, and silk traveled by ship to European markets in unprecedented quantities. The overland Silk Road had not disappeared. It had become regional rather than global. Caravans still crossed between Bukhara and Kashgar. Pilgrims still journeyed toward Mecca along Central Asian routes. Nomadic pastoralists continued seasonal migrations across steppe and mountain, but the grand transcontinental artery that once connected Han China to Rome through a chain of intermediaries no longer held the same economic weight. The decline was also ecological. Maintaining oasis cities in arid regions required intricate irrigation systems. When political instability disrupted maintenance, canals silted up. Wells dried. Some settlements shrank or were abandoned. Desert sands, always patient, reclaimed streets and courtyards. Travel narratives from later centuries speak of ruins, walls half buried, towers eroded, faint outlines of once thriving towns. These were not relics of a mythic golden age, but reminders of how dependent human settlement is upon sustained cooperation and labour. Yet even as overland trade diminished, the cultural imprints of the Silk Road deepened. In Istanbul's markets, Chinese porcelain inspired Ottoman ceramic traditions. In Safavid Persia, miniature painting reflected a fusion of Persian elegance and influences transmitted through Mongol and Chinese contact. In Europe, fascination with Cathay lingered in literature and cartography long after accurate geographic knowledge replaced myth. The Silk Road lived on in imagination. By the 18th century, Enlightenment thinkers in Europe increasingly conceptualized world history in terms of civilizational exchange. Scholars studied Arabic translations of Greek texts, recognizing that classical knowledge had been preserved and expanded in Islamic centers that themselves were connected to older Eurasian networks. In Central Asia, cities like Bukhara and Khiva maintained scholarly traditions rooted in centuries of intellectual cross-pollination. Madrasas taught jurisprudence and theology shaped by dialogues that had once traveled caravan paths. But the 19th century brought another transformation: industrialization. Steam power accelerated maritime travel and eventually rail transport. The Suez Canal, opened in 1869, shortened sea routes between Europe and Asia dramatically. Goods that once took months to cross deserts could now move more swiftly by ship and rail. Russia extended railways into Central Asia, linking Tashkent to Moscow. Infrastructure that had once depended on camels now relied on steel tracks. The Silk Road's ancient corridors were reimagined as components of imperial logistics. And yet, something essential was lost in translation. Caravan travel enforced a pace of encounter. Weeks in the same company required negotiation of language and custom. Shared hardship forged mutual understanding. Steamships and railways compressed distance, but also compressed intimacy. Exchange became more efficient, less personal. This is not to romanticize suffering or inefficiency. The Silk Road was never gentle. It was dangerous, unequal, and often exploitative, but it fostered prolonged contact between cultures in ways that later systems sometimes bypassed. By the early 20th century, the phrase Silk Road had entered scholarly vocabulary, retroactively naming a network that had never possessed a single unified identity. The term captured the imagination precisely because the road itself had faded from everyday consciousness. Ruins in the desert stood as silent witnesses. Faded murals in cave temples hinted at centuries of devotion and artistic synthesis. Coins, bearing multiple scripts, testified to commercial fluidity long past. The fading horizon of the Silk Road did not signify failure. Rather, it marked transition. The network had fulfilled its historical role in shaping a connected Eurasia. Maritime globalization inherited its logic of exchange, expanding it across oceans. Today, one can stand in a museum in London, Beijing, or Istanbul and observe artifacts that once traveled by camel across arid plains. One can trace the genealogy of technologies, paper, printing, gunpowder, that reshaped continents. One can taste foods whose ingredients crossed borders centuries ago. The road has faded, but its imprint remains everywhere. Perhaps that is the true nature of great networks. They do not vanish. They dissolve into the structures they helped create. The Silk Road no longer dominates commerce. Caravans no longer set out from Chang'an, bound for the Mediterranean in the same way. Yet the habit of exchange, the recognition that distant peoples are linked by trade and curiosity, persists. In that sense, the horizon has not ended. It has simply moved. History often speaks in the language of empires, of dynasties rising and collapsing, of armies crossing mountains, of rulers issuing decrees. But beneath these vast movements lived individuals whose names were never intended to endure. The Silk Road, for all its grandeur, was sustained by such people. And though most of their voices have been lost to time, a few survived, preserved in dry desert air, sealed in caves, written in ink that refused to fade. In the early 20th century, among the discoveries in the sands of Central Asia, archaeologists uncovered bundles of letters written in Sogdian. These documents, dating to the early 4th century, were found near Dunhuang, far from the Sogdian homeland of Samarkand. They were written by merchants and their families, separated by thousands of miles. One letter, written by a woman to her husband who had gone east to trade, carries a tone that feels startlingly modern. She speaks of hardship, of loneliness, of uncertainty. She describes how she and their daughter struggle in his absence. She worries about political unrest and the fate of their property. She pleads for news. The Silk Road was not merely commerce and adventure, it was separation. For every caravan that departed, someone remained behind, waiting months or years for return. Merchants gambled not only with capital, but with their family's stability. A lost shipment could mean ruin. A raid could mean widowhood. In these letters, we glimpse not statistics, but emotion. Contracts recovered from desert towns reveal the practical mechanics of trade. Agreements specifying quantities of silk. Loans issued with interest rates carefully recorded. Partnerships formed between individuals of different ethnic and religious backgrounds. These documents demonstrate a level of legal sophistication necessary for long-distance commerce. Trust was essential. A merchant in Samarkand might extend credit to a partner in Chang'an based on reputation alone. Networks of kinship and diaspora communities underpinned these transactions. Sogdian merchants established enclaves within Chinese cities, maintaining cultural cohesion while adapting to local customs. In these enclaves, children grew up bilingual. They learned to navigate multiple identities. At home, one language, in the market another. Their lives embodied the Silk Road's hybridity. Artifacts recovered from burial sites deepen this intimacy. A pair of worn leather shoes, a comb carved from bone, fragments of brightly dyed textile, a small wooden figurine carried perhaps as a talisman. Such objects remind us that history was lived at human scale. Consider the caravanserai. To an outside observer, it may appear as simple architecture. A fortified courtyard, cells lining the walls, a heavy gate closed at night. But within those walls unfolded countless exchanges. Merchants haggled by lamplight. Travelers shared stories of distant courts. Guards kept watch while scribes calculated profits. Meals were prepared over shared fires. It was here that languages blended most freely. Sogdian traders conversed with Persian intermediaries. Chinese envoys listened to Turkic dialects. Muslim scholars debated with Buddhist monks. Disagreements arose, certainly, but so too did friendships and alliances. A young camel driver, perhaps born in an oasis town, might hear for the first time of Rome or Baghdad. A Persian artisan might observe Chinese porcelain and attempt to replicate its translucence in his own kiln. A monk might copy a manuscript borrowed from a traveller passing through. These small moments accumulated into transformation. Travel narratives offer further glimpses. When Xuanzang described his journey, he did not focus solely on doctrine. He recorded distances between cities, the quality of roads, the hospitality of rulers. He noted climates and customs. His account reads at times like a guidebook, at times like spiritual reflection. Ibn Battuta, traveling in the 14th century, recorded his impressions of cities from Morocco to China. He described judges, merchants, saints. He marveled at unfamiliar rituals. His writing reveals the subjective experience of crossing cultural thresholds. Even Marco Polo's account, filtered through European expectations, contains observations of daily life. Paper money circulating in markets, postal relay stations functioning efficiently under Mongol oversight, vast cities organized with methodical precision. But beyond famous travelers were thousands who left no memoir. Their presence survives only indirectly in the taxes they paid, the goods they transported, the children they raised. Some stories surface through tragedy. Mass graves discovered along trade routes suggest moments of violent disruption, perhaps raids, perhaps disease. The Black Death left behind skeletal evidence of sudden mortality. DNA analysis confirms the spread of plague along Eurasian corridors, a grim testament to interconnectedness. Other stories survive in art. Murals in Dunhuang depict donors kneeling in prayer, their clothing rendered in careful detail. These figures were not mythical. They were patrons who funded the painting of sacred scenes. Their garments reveal fashion trends influenced by multiple cultures. Their faces reflect ethnic diversity. Coins found in Central Asian hoards bear inscriptions in Greek, Persian, Arabic, Chinese. They circulated across boundaries, passing through countless hands. Each transaction marked a moment of interaction. The Silk Road's human dimension is also evident in its silences. Entire languages once spoken in oasis kingdoms, Tocharian, Khotanese, have vanished. We know them only from fragments recovered in desert ruins. Behind each extinct language lies a community whose daily conversations have dissolved into wind. Religious communities, too, disappeared. Nestorian Christian churches, once active in Central Asia, faded over centuries of political change and shifting majorities. Manichaean congregations, once widespread, dwindled under persecution and assimilation. Their scriptures survive only in scattered fragments. To read these remnants is to sense fragility, and yet resilience is equally present. Families adapted to new rulers. Merchants shifted routes when borders closed. Artisans incorporated foreign techniques into local tradition. The Silk Road demanded flexibility. Those who could not adapt often vanished. Those who could left subtle but enduring marks. One might imagine a single life spanning decades along this road. A boy born in Samarkand in the early 8th century grows up hearing tales of China and Persia. At 16, he joins his father's caravan eastward. He learns to calculate exchange rates in multiple currencies. He learns which oasis wells can be trusted in drought. He hears Buddhist chants in Kucha, negotiates taxes in Kashgar, tastes unfamiliar spices in Bukhara. He marries, fathers children, perhaps never traveling as far again. Yet his household is shaped by distant worlds. Porcelain bowls from China, silver from Persia, religious ideas filtered through merchants and monks. When he dies, he is buried in soil enriched by centuries of exchange. His grave marker may erode. His name may be forgotten, but his participation in the network contributed to a larger tapestry. This is the paradox of the Silk Road. Its grandeur was cumulative. No single merchant or pilgrim created it. It emerged from repetition, journey after journey, transaction after transaction. The voices preserved in letters and artifacts remind us that history is not abstract movement. It is lived experience. Dust settled on their sandals as it settles now. They worried about profit and prayed for protection. They argued over prices and over theology. They felt homesickness beneath foreign stars. When we speak of the Silk Road today, we often imagine sweeping caravans against golden dunes. But within those caravans were individuals with beating hearts and private fears. Their footsteps may no longer mark the sand, but if we listen closely, through manuscripts and murals and broken pottery, we can still hear them. The Silk Road no longer hums with caravans. No long lines of Bactrian camels stretch across the Taklamakan at dawn as they once did. Yet the world we inhabit, its economies, its cultures, its very assumptions about connection, was quietly woven along those vanished paths. To understand the Silk Road's legacy is to recognize that globalization did not begin with steamships or satellites. It began when distant peoples decided that what lay beyond the horizon was worth the risk of reaching. The ancient network dissolved gradually into maritime systems, industrial corridors, and digital highways. But its logic endured. Exchange generates transformation. Isolation is illusion. Consider the concept of East and West. In antiquity, these were not rigid civilizational blocks, but shifting perspectives. From Chang'an, the Mediterranean was the distant West. From Rome, the silk-producing lands were the mysterious East. Between them lay Persia, Central Asia, India, regions neither fully one nor the other, yet essential to both. The Silk Road blurred boundaries long before modern thinkers debated them. It fostered hybrid identities. Sogdian merchants in China adopted Chinese dress while maintaining ancestral language. Persian artisans incorporated Chinese motifs into metalwork. Buddhist philosophy absorbed elements of Taoist vocabulary when translated into Chinese. Civilizations did not merely influence one another, they intertwined. In modern times, the idea of a sharply divided world, of civilizations isolated and inherently opposed, often ignores this deep history of exchange. The Silk Road reminds us that cross-cultural interaction is not an anomaly, but a constant. Its legacy also lives in the global economy. Long-distance trade requires trust mechanisms, financial instruments, and communication systems. Medieval merchants developed letters of credit to reduce the need to transport heavy coinage. Diaspora communities functioned as guarantors of reputation. These practices foreshadowed modern banking and international commerce. The very notion that goods might pass through multiple hands, across multiple jurisdictions, before reaching consumers is ancient. Today's supply chains, stretching from factories in East Asia to markets in Europe and North America, echo patterns established millennia ago. The Silk Road's diffusion of technologies laid foundations for seismic transformations. Paper enabled bureaucratic states and literate cultures to flourish. Printing amplified that potential, eventually fueling religious reformations and scientific revolutions. Gunpowder altered military balance, contributing to the rise of centralized states. The compass facilitated maritime exploration, which in turn initiated a new era of global integration, often violent and exploitative, yet undeniably interconnected. Even cuisine bears its imprint. Noodles traveled westward. Certain scholars argue that pasta's development in Italy reflects long-term diffusion of techniques from East Asia, though the story is complex. Citrus fruits, grapes, almonds, and spices migrated along trade routes, reshaping regional diets. Tea, once confined to East Asia, became a global commodity deeply entwined with colonial history. Textiles reflect similar blending. Silk weaving techniques influenced Persian and Byzantine craftsmanship. Motifs crossed borders, appearing in patterns thousands of miles from their origin. Religiously, the Silk Road cultivated pluralism by necessity. Cities accustomed to hosting merchants of varied faiths developed systems, sometimes fragile, sometimes robust, for coexistence. The memory of these shared spaces complicates narratives of inevitable conflict. In the 19th and 20th centuries, as scholars excavated Silk Road sites and translated recovered manuscripts, a new awareness emerged. The road became a symbol not merely of trade, but of dialogue. In the 21st century, that symbolism has gained renewed political life. Infrastructure initiatives invoke the Silk Road as metaphor for renewed connectivity across Eurasia and beyond. High-speed rail lines now traverse regions once crossed by camel. Containers move along corridors linking inland China to European markets in a fraction of the time ancient caravans required. Yet modern connectivity differs profoundly. Digital networks transmit information instantaneously. Financial markets respond to events across continents in seconds. Air travel compresses what once required years into hours, and still, the essential tension remains. Connectivity brings opportunity and vulnerability alike. Just as the Silk Road carried knowledge and plague together, today's global networks transmit innovation and crisis simultaneously. Economic shocks ripple across borders. Diseases spread through air travel. Cultural trends leap across oceans in days. The ancient road teaches that interdependence is not new, and that managing it wisely has always been a challenge. There is also a quieter legacy: the human appetite for the unfamiliar. Silk captivated Rome not merely for utility, but for its mystery. Spices commanded extraordinary prices because they embodied distance and rarity. Today, global markets trade not only necessities, but experiences. Flavors, fashions, music from distant cultures. Curiosity remains a driving force. The Silk Road also left an intellectual inheritance. It demonstrated that translation is transformative. When Buddhist texts entered China, they were not simply copied, they were interpreted through new philosophical lenses. When Greek works reached Islamic scholars, they were commented upon and expanded. When those texts returned to Europe, they catalyzed fresh inquiry. Ideas grow when they travel. In academic circles, the Silk Road has become a framework for studying connectivity across disciplines. History, archaeology, art history, linguistics, environmental science. It invites scholars to look beyond national narratives and consider broader patterns. Yet the legacy is not purely celebratory. Trade routes facilitated conquest and exploitation. Luxury goods often enriched elites while laborers endured hardship. Slavery, too, moved along these corridors. Power asymmetries shaped exchange. Acknowledging the Silk Road's complexity requires holding both its creativity and its inequality in view. Perhaps the most profound legacy lies in perspective. The Silk Road reveals that civilizations rise not in splendid isolation but through contact. It challenges simplistic narratives of singular origin. It shows that innovation often emerges from borderlands, from places where languages overlap and identities blur. Standing today in Samarkand's Registan Square, one sees architecture shaped by Persian aesthetics, Mongol political history, Islamic scholarship, and echoes of older Central Asian traditions. In Xi'an, formerly Chang'an, one can visit the Great Mosque, built in Chinese architectural style, yet serving Islamic worshippers, whose ancestors arrived centuries ago through trade. These sites embody continuity. The road itself may be silent, but the cities endure. If one listens beyond modern traffic and tourist chatter, one might imagine the distant clang of caravan bells. One might picture monks copying manuscripts by lamplight, merchants arguing over exchange rates, children watching strangers enter their town. The Silk Road wove a world in which distance did not prevent encounter. Today's global civilization, for all its speed and scale, still depends on that principle. The internet is a new caravanserai. Air routes are aerial silk roads. Containers stacked in ports echo the bundles once tied to camelbacks. The world it wove is unfinished. Connection continues. Exchange persists. Cultures adapt and absorb, resist and reshape. The horizon has expanded beyond deserts and mountains into oceans and digital realms. But the impulse that sent Zhang Qian westward, that carried monks to India, that drove merchants across the Pamirs, that impulse remains unchanged. It is the quiet conviction that beyond the known lies possibility. If we return now, after centuries of movement, after empires and caravans and scholars and storms, to the desert itself, we find something unchanged. The Taklamakan still stretches wide and indifferent beneath the sun. The Pamirs still lift their snowbound ridges into thin air. The steppe still ripples like an inland sea beneath restless wind. Geography outlives ambition. It is here, in this silence, that the full arc of the Silk Road becomes clear. Once, these landscapes were not empty. They were threaded with motion. Hooves pressed into sand at dawn. Caravan bells rang softly in cold morning air. Traders squinted toward distant mirages, measuring progress not in miles, but in wells and walls. Today, highways cut across some of those same corridors. Freight trains pass through valleys where caravans once paused. Satellites orbit overhead, mapping terrain that once required months to cross and memorize. Yet if one steps away from asphalt and rail, into open land beyond modern infrastructure, the past feels close. Wind uncovers fragments, a shard of pottery, a weathered coin. the faint outline of an irrigation channel long dry. Archaeologists kneel in these spaces, brushing sand from objects last touched 1,000 years ago. They work carefully, knowing that what they uncover are not treasures in the romantic sense, but evidence of ordinary life. And ordinary life is the Silk Road's greatest story. It began without ceremony. No single ruler declared its creation. It emerged from necessity and curiosity. The Han dynasty sought horses. Merchants sought profit. Monks sought enlightenment. Their motives differed, but their paths converged. Over centuries, that convergence created something unprecedented: sustained transcontinental interaction. The Silk Road was never smooth. It carried violence and vulnerability alongside innovation. Armies marched along it. Plague rode its currents. Entire cities were reduced to ash when resistance met conquest. Yet from these same corridors came paper, printing, mathematical systems, artistic motifs, religious philosophies. It bound Rome to China not through direct familiarity, but through a chain of intermediaries who understood both worlds imperfectly, yet sufficiently. And perhaps that imperfection is key. No traveller along the Silk Road grasped the whole network. A merchant might know the road between Samarkand and Kashgar intimately, yet never see the Mediterranean. A monk might journey from Chang'an to India and back, yet remain unaware of events unfolding in Persia. The network functioned because it did not require total understanding, only partial trust, repeated over generations. This partial vision mirrors our own age. We live in a world shaped by global systems few individuals fully comprehend. Supply chains stretch invisibly across continents. Data travels in pulses beneath oceans. A decision in one financial center ripples outward to places unseen. In this sense, we inhabit a Silk Road of another kind. Yet the ancient road offers lessons. It teaches that connectivity is powerful but fragile. Stability depends on cooperation. When empires fractured and warfare intensified, trade faltered. When irrigation systems were neglected, oases withered. Infrastructure, whether physical or relational, requires care. It teaches that exchange transforms identity. Cultures that encountered one another along caravan routes did not remain unchanged. They absorbed, resisted, reinterpreted. Hybridity became strength. It teaches that curiosity can outlast fear. Despite deserts and bandits, despite political tension, travelers continued to move. The promise of what lay beyond outweighed the danger of leaving home. If we imagine a final caravan, one of the last great transcontinental journeys before maritime trade eclipsed the overland route, we might picture its departure not with fanfare, but with routine familiarity. Camels kneel, loads are secured, contracts signed, families wave farewell. The travellers do not know they are part of an ending. They believe, as generations before them did, that the road will continue indefinitely. And in a sense, it does. Because the Silk Road was never only about camels or silk. It was about the decision to reach outward. When maritime routes expanded, they did not replace that impulse. They extended it. When railways crossed Central Asia, they followed ancient logic of connection. When fiber optic cables now link continents, they trace invisible pathways across oceans, once sailed by explorers who inherited knowledge transmitted over land. The Silk Road lives wherever exchange reshapes the familiar. In modern Xi'an, tourists walk along reconstructed walls near the site of ancient Chang'an. They photograph pagodas and markets revived for visitors. Yet beneath the restored facades lie layers of history, foundations of houses where foreign merchants once lived, workshops where artisans experimented with imported techniques. In Samarkand, the blue domes of Timurid architecture gleam against the sky. Schoolchildren learn of their city's role as a crossroads of civilizations. The memory of exchange is embedded in civic identity. In Istanbul's bazaars, spices still mound in vivid colors. Carpets still hang in intricate patterns. Though modern commerce operates at global scale, the atmosphere of negotiation and cultural layering feels ancient. Even in places far removed from Central Asia, the Silk Road's legacy persists. Libraries filled with printed books, fireworks lighting national celebrations, foods flavored by ingredients once rare and distant. The wind over the desert carries no sound of caravan bells now, but it moves across landscapes shaped by centuries of human passage. It drifts through abandoned cities and active towns alike. It crosses borders indifferent to political lines. And if one listens, truly listens, in that wind, there is memory. Memory of Zhang Qian riding west with imperial ambition. Memory of Faxian crossing the Gobi in search of scripture. Memory of Sogdian merchants calculating profit by lamplight. Memory of Mongol riders thundering across the steppe. Memory of plague and of prayer, of invention and of longing. 25 centuries of movement condensed into silence. The Silk Road did not create civilization, but it accelerated its conversation. It proved that distance could be negotiated, that mountains could be crossed, that deserts could be skirted, that strangers could become partners, rivals, teachers, or friends. As night settles over the imagined desert, stars emerge one by one. They are the same stars that guided caravans long ago. Travelers once navigated by them, trusting patterns traced across darkness. Today, we navigate by different instruments, yet we remain guided by orientation, by the desire to know where we are in relation to others. That is the Silk Road's final gift. It reminds us that humanity has always been in motion. That connection is ancient, that the world has long been larger and smaller at the same time. The road beneath the sand may fade, but the journey continues. If we step fully into the present, carrying with us the weight of centuries, the Silk Road no longer appears as a relic. It feels instead like a foundation, buried perhaps, but load-bearing. Stand in a modern logistics hub where containers are stacked like geometric towers, each marked with codes that trace their origin. One may have departed from inland China by rail, crossing Kazakhstan and Russia before arriving in Europe. Another may travel by sea through the Strait of Malacca and the Suez Canal. These are not camel caravans. They move faster in far greater volume. But the principle is unchanged. Goods traveling vast distances through coordinated systems of trust and infrastructure. Rail corridors now link Xi'an, once Chang'an, to cities such as Duisburg in Germany. Trains traverse steppes and mountains along routes that echo older caravan tracks. What once required a year can now be completed in weeks. Steel wheels have replaced padded hooves, yet the geography remains the same. In Central Asia, independent nations that emerged after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, find themselves once again positioned between larger powers. Their cities, many of which were once Silk Road hubs, are rediscovering their historical identity as crossroads. Samarkand hosts international conferences invoking its legacy of scholarship and exchange. Bukhara restores ancient madrasas, presenting them not as ruins, but as living heritage. Kashgar, though reshaped by modern development, still markets itself as a node of cultural convergence. The Silk Road has become narrative capital. Governments reference it to frame infrastructure projects. Tourism campaigns evoke caravans and spice markets. Universities design research programs under its banner, encouraging interdisciplinary study of connectivity across Eurasia. Yet beneath these symbolic invocations lies something tangible: the enduring importance of transcontinental exchange. Energy pipelines stretch across Central Asia, carrying oil and natural gas along corridors once traveled by traders of silk and jade. Fiber optic cables follow similar paths, transmitting data at speeds unimaginable to earlier centuries. Where monks once carried manuscripts in saddlebags, information now travels as pulses of light beneath the earth. The language has changed, from caravanserais to logistics hubs, from paisa tablets to customs documentation systems. But the choreography of movement remains intricate. Modern globalization is often described as unprecedented. In scale and speed, it is. But in structure, it mirrors ancient patterns. Peripheral regions become central when routes shift. Political stability encourages commerce. Conflict disrupts it. Technological innovation reshapes geography's constraints, but does not eliminate them. Consider how quickly supply chains falter when conflict erupts in a transit region. Rail lines close. Shipping lanes become contested. Prices surge. The Silk Road teaches that connectivity is never automatic. It is maintained through cooperation and sometimes fragile compromise. Culturally, the legacy is equally visible. Diaspora communities continue to bridge distant worlds. Just as Sogdian merchants once settled in Chang'an, modern migrant communities maintain ties across continents. Cuisine, language, and tradition intermingle in global cities. Children grow up navigating multiple identities, much like those bilingual families of oasis towns centuries ago. Art continues to blend influences. Contemporary designers draw on Central Asian motifs, once shaped by Persian and Chinese synthesis. Musicians fuse instruments whose ancestors traveled across caravan routes. Scholars collaborate across borders using digital tools that compress distance. Yet modern interconnection also magnifies inequality. The Silk Road of antiquity enriched some and marginalized others. Luxury goods catered to elites, while laborers endured risk. Today's global networks similarly generate vast wealth alongside disparity. The lesson is not that exchange is inherently unjust, but that systems require ethical stewardship. In the deserts of Xinjiang and the steppes of Kazakhstan, archaeologists continue to uncover sites that complicate simple narratives. They reveal how climate shifts influenced settlement patterns. They study ancient DNA to trace migrations and disease pathways. Science itself now travels globally, building upon questions first asked when manuscripts emerged from sand. Environmental historians examine how oasis agriculture sustained caravan cities for centuries, and how overuse or political neglect led to decline. These insights resonate in an age confronting climate change and resource scarcity. The Silk Road story underscores the delicate balance between human ambition and ecological reality. If one were to fly over Central Asia at night, modern cities would glow like constellations on Earth's surface. Highways form luminous threads. Airports pulse with movement. It is a different kind of network, yet the visual metaphor is strikingly similar to ancient star charts used by travelers. The sky remains constant. Navigation evolves. Perhaps the most enduring echo of the Silk Road lies not in infrastructure or economics, but in imagination. Writers and filmmakers continue to romanticize caravans against endless horizons. Scholars reconstruct forgotten languages to recover voices long silent. Travelers retrace segments of the old routes, seeking experiential connection to history. Why does this road endure in collective memory? Because it represents possibility. It symbolizes a world in which distance can be crossed, in which exchange yields enrichment, in which cultures are not sealed containers but permeable landscapes. It also cautions that connection carries consequence. When plague spread along caravan routes, it revealed the cost of integration without understanding contagion. When empires fought for control of trade corridors, it demonstrated how commerce can incite conflict as well as cooperation. Modern society confronts similar dilemmas. Digital networks transmit information and misinformation alike. Global trade lifts millions from poverty while straining ecosystems. Travel expands awareness, but accelerates disease spread. The Silk Road offers perspective. It reminds us that these tensions are not new, only amplified. Imagine standing again at the edge of the Taklamakan as twilight falls. The desert is quiet. Far in the distance, a freight train hums along steel tracks. Its cargo containers bear labels in multiple languages. It will cross borders overnight. The sound fades. Wind resumes dominance. If one closes their eyes, it is possible to layer time. Hear the faint chime of caravan bells beneath the train's rumble. See torchlight flicker beside electric glow. Smell wood smoke intermingled with diesel. Past and present coexist. The Silk Road is no longer a single continuous artery. It is a palimpsest, layers of movement inscribed upon the same terrain. Each generation writes its own version atop what came before, and so we arrive at a final understanding. The Silk Road was never only about silk. It was about connection forged across difficulty, about exchange that reshaped belief and technology, about individuals who stepped beyond the familiar and accepted uncertainty in pursuit of gain, material or spiritual. The modern sky above Eurasia is filled not only with stars, but with aircraft tracing luminous arcs between continents. Satellites orbit silently. Signals bounce invisibly between devices in distant hands. We are, in our own way, travelers on an expanded Silk Road. And like those who came before us, we navigate a world made smaller by connection and larger by possibility. The echo beneath the modern sky is not silence. It is continuity. Night settles slowly over the desert. There is a moment, just after the sun sinks but before the stars fully declare themselves, when the world seems suspended between eras. The dunes lose their sharp edges. The mountains soften into silhouettes. Wind moves lightly across the sand, erasing what little trace the day has left behind. It is here, between light and darkness, that the Silk Road feels closest. Not as a trade network, not as a political strategy, not as an academic subject, but as a human memory. For over 2,000 years, people walked these horizons. They did not call it the Silk Road. They did not see the grand arc of history unfolding beneath their feet. They saw only the next well, the next pass, the next market. And yet, from those countless small steps, something vast emerged. If we trace the journey from the beginning, back to the Han envoy riding west in search of allies, we see how fragile the origins were. A diplomatic mission, nearly forgotten, a curiosity about horses, a whisper of lands beyond the frontier. From that whisper grew a web. Silk moved west, silver moved east. Paper drifted into new hands. Faith crossed languages. Empires tried to command the flow and often failed. Conquerors unified the road, then fractured it again. Disease followed trade. Knowledge followed curiosity. Cities bloomed in unlikely places. Oases sustained by ingenuity and cooperation. Markets echoed with bargaining in half-understood dialects. Caravanserais sheltered strangers who would never meet again after dawn. And always, the horizon pulled travelers onward. The Silk Road was never a straight line. It was braided, looping, diverging. When war closed one corridor, another opened. When political power shifted, merchants adapted. When belief systems encountered one another, they did not remain unchanged. The road endured not because it was stable, but because it was flexible. That flexibility is its final lesson. The caravans have gone. The Mongol relay stations are dust. The great Tang capital is layered beneath modern Xi'an. Samarkand's markets now welcome tourists and scholars instead of camel trains bound for distant empires. But the impulse remains. Every time a culture adopts an idea born elsewhere, the Silk Road breathes again. Every time a language absorbs a foreign word, the road extends. Every time a person leaves home, whether across deserts or across oceans, in search of knowledge, livelihood, or meaning, the ancient rhythm repeats. In the deep hours of night, imagine a single lantern burning in a caravanserai courtyard centuries ago. Around it sit travelers from different lands. They do not share a mother tongue. They do not share a single faith. Yet they share bread. They share stories. They share the temporary safety of walls built to welcome strangers. The lantern flickers. Beyond the walls, the desert stretches without boundary. Within them, humanity gathers. When dawn comes, they will part ways. Some will head east, others west. A few may never complete their journeys. But the fact that they met at all, here, in this improbable intersection of geography and will, is the miracle. That is the Silk Road. Not merely silk, not merely trade, but encounter. As we close this journey, let the images settle gently. The early morning departure from Chang'an, the painted caves of Dunhuang glowing in lamplight, the climb into the thin air of the Pamirs, the markets of Samarkand ringing with barter, the thunder of Mongol cavalry reshaping continents, the quiet scratch of a monk translating scripture by candle flame, the slow arrival of plague carried by unseen passengers, the rise of ships along distant coasts, the rediscovery of buried cities beneath drifting sand, the hum of a modern freight train crossing the same ancient corridors. All of it belongs to one continuous story. The Silk Road reminds us that history is not isolated chapters, but overlapping journeys. That civilizations do not stand alone, but lean into one another, across time. And now, as the final lantern dims, we return to stillness. The desert cools. Stars spread across the sky, unchanged from the nights when caravans navigated by their light. The wind moves softly, carrying no goods, no armies, no proclamations, only memory. If you listen carefully, you might hear it, a faint echo of bells, a murmur of distant voices, a road that was never a road, stretching not only across continents, but across centuries, and somewhere, Far beyond the horizon, another traveler sets out, guided by the same quiet certainty that the world is wider than the place where they stand. The journey never truly ends. It simply continues, in new forms, beneath new skies. And now, the road grows quiet. The camels have knelt. The market lanterns have dimmed. The last trader has folded his ledger and stepped inside the caravanserai. Outside, the desert breathes in long, slow currents of wind, smoothing the sand where countless footsteps once passed. For a moment, imagine yourself there. The sky is wide and dark, scattered with stars that guided travelers for centuries. No engines, no voices, only distance, and the soft hush of night settling over Earth that has carried empires. The Silk Road was never only about movement. It was about the courage to move, the willingness to meet, the patience to cross what seemed uncrossable. It was about people who believed that beyond the horizon, something waited, something worth the risk. And tonight, as we close this journey, you don't need to cross deserts or mountains. You don't need to calculate exchange rates or navigate by starlight. You can simply rest. Let the dunes stretch out in your mind. Let the mountains fade into shadow. Let the caravan bells grow softer and softer and softer still. The road continues, not in sand, but in the quiet connections that shape our world even now. But for you, for this moment, there is nowhere left to travel. The lantern is low. The stars are steady. The wind is calm. And the Silk Road, at last, is sleeping. Good night.